Hello, I'm Robbie Kegrice. Welcome to this segment on Revelation chapter 1. I'd like to speak to you in this segment about thinking historically. Thinking historically. More specifically, I'd like to talk about the authenticity of John's experience and its relation to historical exegesis. It might sound like some big words, but I hope that as we go through this, we can break that down and help you see the significance of what we're talking about before interpreting the book of Revelation. As I've taught Revelation in the past, I've often found that students are surprised by the way that scholars, whether in commentaries or videos, or even in this class, speak about John as the writer of Revelation. When students hear phrases or read phrases such as John's intent in this piece of literature, or John's use of symbols in Revelation, or John's use of the Old Testament, students sometimes get the sense that there is at work in those kinds of statements perhaps a subtle denial of Revelation's divine inspiration. After all, the students might reason, if John is seeing all this in a vision and simply reporting it, well, does it really make any sense to talk about John's theology or John's message or John's interpretation of the Old Testament? Isn't it all simply the divine message conveyed through John? And shouldn't we simply talk about God's message in this book? Why do we keep attributing things to John? So it's important to understand that our efforts at historical exegesis, trying to recover what John was trying to say to his readers in the first century, those efforts are not a denial of the authenticity of John's experience or of inspiration. To try to explain that, I will begin with a historical question about the authenticity of John's vision of Jesus in Revelation chapter 1. When you read John's description of his vision of Christ, and I won't read it here for time's sake, but you can read it in the latter half of Revelation chapter 1. A question that might arise for secular readers is, did John really see the risen Jesus? Or is he making this up to give his book a sense of divine authority? Wouldn't that be a good way to convince people that what you're about to write is worthy of their attention? To make a claim that, wow, God appeared to me and gave me this message. Well, given that secular readers really have no particular reason to believe in claims of divine visitation or biblical inspiration, whether in the Bible or elsewhere, they might naturally conclude that it's more likely than not that John just simply made up this story of seeing Jesus for the sake of giving his work a sense of heavenly origin. In contrast, Christians who come to the Bible with the assumption of divine inspiration, that question, did John really see Jesus? Well, that might seem to need no answer. They might simply assume that John saw Jesus just as he describes him. End of story. Even hearing someone raise the question as to whether or not John really saw Jesus just as he describes in Revelation 1, well, that might seem disrespectful to the Scriptures even to say such a thing. After all, Christians might reason, if we can't take John's testimony here as authentic, well, how can we believe anything he says? And then for that matter, since Revelation is part of the Bible, well then, if John's testimony is not accurate, how can we believe anything in the Bible? Well, faced with questions such as these and possibilities such as those, Christians might say, well, let's just not ask that question. It seems to be a little bit too threatening. And so let's just simply insist that, yes, John saw Christ, just as he describes Jesus in chapter 1. Well, in response to both sets of readers, no matter from which perspective someone might be coming on that question. I would suggest that historically speaking, now I want to be careful to underscore that, not confessionally thinking or theologically speaking, just historically speaking, we really have no way to prove definitively whether or not John saw Jesus as he relates in Revelation chapter 1. We can't prove it. We can't show it beyond a shadow of a doubt or a reasonable doubt. However, I would like to suggest that there are some relevant arguments that we can make that suggest we should take John's story seriously from a historical perspective. And keep in mind, the first part of this exercise is about thinking historically. First, there are at least 4 reasons it's unlikely that John is simply fabricating an experience, and that his account is an authentic report. So let me review those 4 reasons with you briefly. Number 1, the self-understanding of the book of Revelation is that it is a work of prophetic utterance. By self-understanding, I mean when you read the book of Revelation, what kinds of things do you find there about the book itself? What kind of reflections does it have on itself? What kind of statements does it make about its own content? Those reflections and that content continually point back to the conclusion that John understands this to be a work of prophetic utterance. Let's think about that for a moment. John explicitly claims that his visions occurred during prayer in the Spirit. Those 3 words are a direct quote from John, in the Spirit. Chapter 1, verse 10, chapter 4, verse 2, again in chapter 17, verse 3, and once more in chapter 21, verse 10. And we know from the rest of the New Testament that visionary or prophetic experience during prayer and through the influence of the Spirit was fairly common. In Acts chapter 10, we have Peter having a vision. A sheet leapt down from heaven full of animals. It's recounted again in chapter 11 of Acts. Paul, in chapter 22 of the book of Acts, mentions an experience during prayer of this sort. The influence of the Spirit operating prophetically in Christians is promised to all in Acts chapter 2, verse 18. The prophet Agabus in Acts chapter 21 engages in a symbolic action to warn the Apostle Paul of what awaits him in his upcoming journeys. So John is not unique in claiming to have experienced visionary, prophetic experience in the Spirit. Nor is John the first one in the New Testament to have claimed to gaze into heaven. In Acts chapter 7, Stephen, as he's being martyred, gazes into heaven and sees Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Nor is this the first claim in the New Testament that someone is transported into heaven, whether in a vision or bodily, some kind of bodily transport. John doesn't get very specific about the nature of his transport into heaven. But in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul mentions that he knows someone, probably speaking of himself, who was transported into heaven and saw amazing things there. In Acts chapter 8, Philip, the evangelist, is transported physically from one location to another. So the passages of Scripture in which all of these experiences occur do not treat these experiences just as symbolic or metaphorical ways of speaking about theological ideas. They actually treat these as real experiences that first century Christians were having. So when John explains to his readers that he was in the Spirit, it's likely that his readers would nod approvingly. Perhaps many of them, maybe all of them. having themselves had experiences in the Spirit, perhaps not as amazing as John's, perhaps not as grandiose as John's, but experiences nonetheless that would give them a context from which they could relate to the experiences that John is sharing with them. So on all these fronts, we see that John is operating in the context of charismatic first century Christianity, in which prophetic type experience in the Spirit, it was an accepted dimension of following Christ. Now, of course, someone might want to make the point and argue that, well, historically we can't prove that any of these experiences happened. Well, historically, we could actually demonstrate that it's quite likely that many of them did, particularly the ones that were public and so forth. How to interpret them, were they actually divine, were they products of people's imaginations? There's an element there that is certainly by faith. The point here is not that we're trying to defend each one of those experiences in terms of its historical authenticity, but we're saying that the New Testament itself and the Christians of the first century certainly took all of these experiences seriously. And so John, writing the book of Revelation, writing in the Spirit, there is a self-understanding here that this is a not surprising way of delivering a message. It's not a surprising way of receiving a message from God and delivering it. The second point in favor of seeing John's account of seeing Jesus in Revelation 1 as historically authentic, it follows from the first. The prologue, Revelation 1, 1-3, shows that John's experience was recognized as legitimate by his close associates. Now, these three verses, I suggest, are actually a short commentary on the book of Revelation. In Revelation 1, 1-3, John is spoken of in the third person. He's spoken of as he. And it's not until verse 4 of Revelation that we actually have John introducing himself. So those first three verses serve as, it seems, sort of a recommendation, if you will, or short commentary on what the book is about, a recommendation of its usefulness by John's close associates, possibly the people that carried the written document from the Isle of Patmos, where John was isolated, over to the mainland, where it would be read in the churches. Whoever those people around John were that composed those first several verses, in those verses they show us that they are confident in what he has shared. So John's experience was recognized as legitimate by his close associates. The people close to John received his message, and we find no sense of confusion or skepticism among them about the authenticity of his experience. A third argument against the conclusion that John is just making up the experience of seeing Jesus just to give his book some divine authority is that John does not resort to pseudopigraphy. Now, what is pseudopigraphy? Pseudopigraphy is a practice that was not all that uncommon in the first century AD and in the century or two before that as well, of writing a book in the name of some hero from the past, like Abraham, Moses, or Elijah, and often showing them as having some kind of exalted spiritual experience or some kind of special revelation from God. And pseudopigraphy was employed by writers as a way of lending authority and weight to their own work. So if I am a fairly unknown and nameless person in the first century, but I'm zealous to have my message about God received by others, well, if I write my message out in a book and then say that somehow construct it so it seems as though Abraham is the one who actually delivered it long ago, or Moses or Isaiah, well, then that's a way of trying to get people to receive what I have said. And we have many examples of that from that era. But John doesn't do that. In delivering his message, John presents himself as a leader in the context of the early Christian community that he's writing to. He doesn't claim any identity beyond his own. In fact, he doesn't even claim the office of apostle. Now, there's controversy over whether John the Apostle, a member of the original 12, wrote this book, or whether it was another John, John the Elder. But if it was John the Apostle, we see that there's no claim to that apostleship. And the only thing that John really claims for himself in this book in terms of his identity, he simply says in Revelation 1:9 that he's a companion in suffering and tribulation. So that's the only credentials that he claims. If John had been willing to fabricate an experience, if he had been willing to make up a vision of Jesus, well then why not make up some more weighty identity for himself? Why not make up an identity like Elijah or Elisha or Samuel or Ezekiel or Daniel? John doesn't do it. So the fact that John simply reports his experience in his own name, once again, it suggests that he feels no need to defend the authenticity of his report, and it suggests that fabrication is really not something that he's interested in. A fourth reason suggesting John does not simply offer a made-up story of seeing Jesus, it relates to the environment or the ethos of the Christian communities that he's a part of. The tone of John's greeting, he says he's a companion and fellow sufferer, suggests that these communities, they know John, they trust him. And most commentators will agree with that these communities probably looked to John as a guide and as a leader. So does it seem likely that in an early Christian context where faithfulness to Jesus was paramount, that John would make up a vision of Jesus? Jesus, who is called the faithful and true witness? It seems very inconsistent that John would simply fabricate an experience. John writes in Revelation 21:8 that all liars will have their portion in a lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. This is the most serious, irreversible warning, punishment of which we have a vision in the book of Revelation. And it seems difficult to reconcile a scenario in which John is making up an experience of having seen the risen Lord with a statement that all liars will find their place in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur. So with those kinds of reasons in mind, it seems historically unlikely that John is simply making up an experience of seeing Jesus in Revelation chapter 1, to give his work some kind of air of divine authority. But here's the thing. From a historical perspective, even if we grant that John is not simply inventing this vision of Jesus to make his book authoritative, even if we grant that, that does not necessarily mean that John really saw Jesus. Again, our point here is to think historically. Now, some people might say, well, he could have been hallucinating. Maybe he was having just a vivid dream. Or maybe, he was otherwise experiencing something produced within his own mind. All visions don't necessarily come from the divine realm. they can come from our own imagination. However, that doesn't really seem to hold water here, those kinds of possibilities. You know, the complexity and the highly intricate images in the book seem to speak against the idea that John is simply recounting some sort of delusion or some sort of hallucination, even a vivid dream. Scholarly commentaries on Revelation uniformly will show anyone who reads them seriously that the book of Revelation is highly complex. The literary artistry and the theological craftsmanship are profound in the book. Scholars are still trying to figure out the structure of Revelation. Whatever else we might conclude about how the book of Revelation originated, it just does not seem reasonable to attribute it to some kind of confused imagination, you know, some kind of delusional or hallucinatory experience. That just doesn't really fit. So again, can we say, on the basis of all of that, that it's historically certain John saw Jesus as he recounts in chapter 1? Well, no. Historically speaking, we cannot say it certain. The experience that John relates is private. There are no witnesses. Only John and Jesus are involved. So, consequently, in historical terms, from our perspective looking back, we have no way historically of really demonstrating with some kind of certainty, definitively, that yes, John saw Jesus just as he says in Revelation chapter 1. As I've discussed, we do have some good reasons for concluding that he did see Jesus. But ultimately, historically, we cannot demonstrate it. You see the distinction? And that's really what I want you to get in this first part here. What we're talking about when we're thinking historically. We're talking about what happened. We're not talking about what we believe. We're not talking about our theology. We're talking about what happened. Now, we'll talk about that in other segments in terms of what was John thinking. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So, did John see Jesus? Personally, I believe that he did. But that's a matter of faith. It's not a matter of uninformed faith. It's not a leap in the dark. It's not a conclusion based on zero evidence. I have good reasons for thinking that John did see Jesus. We've discussed historical reasons. There are other reasons as well, both theological, spiritual, and so forth. But my point now is that we either believe it or we don't. So it's a matter of faith. Christian readers, perhaps for reasons much like John's first century Christian readers, will probably be inclined to trust John's testimony. Okay. Right at this point is where we transition away from the question, did John see Jesus? Remember, that was our historical question, talking about thinking historically. I want to transfer over to thinking about historical exegesis. This is our hermeneutical question. And this brings me back to what I mentioned earlier when I said that oftentimes students, when we're talking about the book of Revelation, they grow uncomfortable with the way scholars talk about it as John's writing, what is John's intent, what is John's use of symbolism, etc. If we accept the authenticity of John's account in chapter 1, okay, so we've been talking about that. Let's say we do accept it. Let's say that we say, okay, in Revelation chapter 1, John saw Jesus. If we accept that, what does that mean for us when we accept it? What do we assume whenever we accept that? When we say, yes, John saw Jesus, does that mean that what we have in Revelation chapter 1 is merely a factual report, as though John is just recounting events and sites the way a newspaper reporter would repeat elements of a story? So if I'm a newspaper reporter, I go out, hopefully, I'm just telling this is what happened, this is what I saw. Is that the way John is doing it? Even if we grant that John really saw the risen Lord, is John simply recounting his experience as though he is some kind of human typewriter on which the divine message is just being hammered out? Even if we accept that he has received a divine visitation from Jesus in chapter 1, is he merely reciting for us the bare facts of the event when he writes this? Now, once again, here's where we come up against something we don't really know all of the dynamics. Even if we grant that John really saw Jesus, and I believe that he did, we have to admit that we have no way to know for sure what the path from that visionary experience to his literary composition looked like. Let me say that again. We don't know what the pathway looked like from the experience to the literary composition. Now, we're not implying that John may have played fast and loose with the divine revelation, like, oh, John had an experience, but then he just made of it whatever he wanted to, embellishing it or obscuring it in ways that would detract from the divine intention. That's not what we're saying. In fact, John warns in the last chapter of Revelation, warns about playing fast and loose with divine revelation. But when we acknowledge that we don't know what the path looked like from the experience to the composition as a book, what we're acknowledging is that our understanding of that process is limited, extremely limited. Let's phrase it as a question. What goes into the formulation of such a complex prophetic literary work? What happens between experience and vision and actually writing it down? Now, that's an interesting question. We don't have all the answers. But let me use an illustration here, or an example that I think is perhaps helpful. This is not an endorsement in any particular way of this book, but again, I'm using this as an example. Here's a book called The Final Quest by Rick Joyner, and in the front of this book, he describes, this book is very full of images and symbolism and so forth. So in some ways, it's kind of reminiscent of the book of Revelation. Joyner, again, I'm not passing judgment either way. Joyner claims to operate in the prophetic. So let me read to you just a paragraph from page 11. He says, "The visions contained in this book all began with a dream. Some of it came under a very intense sense of the presence of the Lord, but the overwhelming majority was received in some level of a trance. Most of it came on the level where I was still conscious of my surroundings and could even interact with them, such as answering the phone. When they were interrupted, or when things got so intense that I would have to get up and walk around, when I sat back down, I would immediately be right back where I had left off. Once the experience became so intense that I actually got up and left the mountain cabin where I go to seek the Lord and drove home. Over a week later, I returned, and almost immediately I was right back where I left off." So, in the case of this book that I just read a quote from the introduction or preface, we see that the final product, which is fairly, for this kind of literature, I would say, for a visionary thing, fairly lengthy. it's fairly lengthy, and it's a continuous story. So that final product was the result of a process that involved multiple experiences across a period of time. And he mentions how that there were different sorts of experiences, and that sometimes there were long gaps in between, it'd start and stop, picking up at the same place. So all of that is just to illustrate something here. When one reads the final literary product, when we read this book, the process by which it was produced has been obscured. Not hidden in any kind of manipulative way, but simply left out. The starts and the stops have all been collapsed into a single narrative. Now, certainly, Joyner is not claiming divine inspiration for his book. He's certainly not trying to put it on a level with Scripture, and I'm certainly not doing the same thing. I don't want to equate it with Scripture. That's not the intent. I'm simply using it as an illustration of a point. The compositional process between divine encounter and finished prophetic literary work may be more complex than is immediately evident to us simply from reading the text. Now, to what extent is that the case in the book of Revelation? We don't know. Did it all happen at one time? We don't know. Did it all happen, did it happen in 5 parts with a week in between each? Well, we don't know. Did it all happen in the same way? We don't know. What we do know from the book is that John's writing, including his vision of Jesus in chapter 1, is rich with imagery and with allusions to Old Testament passages and themes. Did Jesus have white hair in John's vision? Revelation 1, hair white as snow. Did Jesus have white hair in the vision? Well, it would seem so. But when did it hit John that the white hair was reminiscent of the hair white like wool of the Ancient of Days in Daniel 7? So in other words, when John saw the vision and he sees Jesus and Jesus has white hair, is it at that moment that John says, aha, his hair is white like wool, which is an allusion to the Ancient of Days in Daniel 7. Did that hit John right at that moment, or was it later? Was it in between when he got that revelation and when he got the revelation of chapter 5, 6, or 7? Well, we don't know. Maybe it was right away. Maybe it was later. And as John saw the things that God was showing him, as he meditated on those sorts of connections between what he saw in visionary experience and what he knew from the Old Testament and so forth, how did those connections, like the connection with Daniel 7 and the Ancient of Days with hair white like wool, those sorts of connections with Old Testament passages, and even with things in the other aspects of the Christian gospel and things within his own culture, how did those connections inform or enrich or enlarge his understanding of what he saw in the vision? We don't know exactly. And I'm suggesting here that as someone who believes in the inspiration of Scripture, that we can see the inspiration of Scripture not only in the fact or moment that John has the experience of seeing into heaven or seeing Jesus, but also in the process of reflection and meditation on those experiences and the connections that emerged from that meditation. What I hope you can begin to see is how this opens up a broad horizon of possibilities for how the composition of Revelation might have proceeded. So as we realize that, we start to grasp that we don't have to determine the precise nature of John's spiritual experience or how it relates to the Old Testament, how it relates to the Christian gospel, how it relates to his own culture and time. Where did all of the insights come from? Did they come directly, boom, in the moment of vision? Did they come as he meditated on those connections? We don't have to figure that all out. We don't need to opt for very simplistic frameworks that would leave us either with, oh, John just got all of this and he just wrote it out like he was a human typewriter. That's not really an evangelical doctrine of inspiration anyways. We don't have to opt for that, or this view that, well, John was just engaged in a purely imaginative work of his own literary creativity and he had no visions and he just made that up to give it all some sense of divine authority. We don't have to get stuck in between or stuck in a place where it's either all divine inspiration in a sense that John's a typewriter, or, well, John just made it all up. That's a false dichotomy. We can acknowledge the divine inspiration and the origin of John's experience. We can acknowledge that, yes, John did meet Jesus. Yes, John did have a heavenly vision. Yes, he did encounter God in this amazing way. But at the same time, that doesn't strip out or eliminate the space for John also to be engaged in a work of literary and theological complexity and artistry. So the two are not mutually exclusive. And so we can talk about John's intent. What was John trying to say? Why did John use the Old Testament this way? And whenever we speak about the book of Revelation in those kinds of ways, we're not denying its divine inspiration. We're not denying that John actually saw Jesus or that he actually saw into heaven. We're just acknowledging that between experience of the divine on the one hand and reflection and meditation on the significance of those experiences, there's a journey in between those that John doesn't really give us details about. So as we read the book, we can both acknowledge its divine origin as well as talk about the literary and theological intent, or the literary structure of the book, the theological message of the book, John's intent as a writer, John's use of symbols, etc., etc. So in this class, in these video segments, as we look at passages, as we do exegesis of various things in the book, we will speak continually of John as the author, and we'll speak continually of John's intention. So we're not in any way undermining or implying an absence of divine inspiration. We're not denying that John had a real experience. But we're focusing on the form of the text as we have it, asking how it communicates meaning. We're searching for clues. We're doing historical exegesis. We're saying, how does this book employ connections with the Old Testament? How does its literary structure convey meaning? What's the shape of the grammar? What are the images that John has used? How does he connect what he's saying to symbols that would be meaningful within the context of the Roman Empire, and so on. All right, so thank you for waiting with me through these preliminary thoughts on thinking historically and on the authenticity of John's experience and its relation to historical exegesis.